December 4th, 2015. Washington, D.C. The Kennedy Center Opera House glows under warm gold light, its red velvet seats filling slowly with senators, generals, and old friends who have waited a lifetime for this night. Somewhere behind a heavy curtain, a woman in a floor-length mink coat sits in a folding chair, her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. She has sung this song more times than she can count. Tonight, she does not need to rehearse it. She only needs to remember why she first sang it at all. Aretha Franklin was 69 years old that winter, and by then the world had already given her every title it could think of. Queen of Soul. First woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A voice so instantly recognizable that radio stations rarely needed to say her name before playing her records. But backstage that night, none of the awards seemed to matter to her. What mattered was a song written in 1967, the year everything changed for her, and a president sitting in the audience who was about to lose control of his own composure. She did not know that yet. She only knew the lights, the silence, and the piano waiting for her downstage. Stop. To understand why that moment broke a president's composure, you have to go back nearly 70 years to a house in Detroit where a little girl was already singing before anyone thought to write it down. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25, 1942, in Memphis, Tennessee, and moved with her family to Detroit as a small child. Her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was one of the most influential black preachers in the country, a man whose sermons were recorded and sold on vinyl, whose home on La Salle Boulevard became an unofficial gathering place for gospel royalty. Sam Cooke came through those rooms. Mahalia Jackson came through those rooms. The sound of the black church in America, in all its grief and all its glory, moved through that house like weather. Aretha's mother, Barbara, left the family when Aretha was 6 and died only 4 years later. The girl who would grow up to tell the world exactly what respect meant had already learned before she was 10 years old what it meant to lose someone without warning. She turned toward the one thing that never left her, the choir. She sang alto beside women twice her age in her father's New Bethel Baptist Church. And by the time she was 14, she was already the featured soloist on gospel recordings. Her voice somehow both a child's and an ancient woman's at once. By 14, she was also a mother herself, the first of 2 sons born to her before she was 18. It is a detail her biographers have handled carefully and briefly, and this account will do the same. It happened, it was hard, and her family closed ranks around her so she could keep singing. Whatever weight that placed on a teenage girl, she carried it quietly, the way she would carry so much else in the decades to come. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a gifted child once people realize what she can do. Adults stop treating her like a child. They start treating her like an instrument. Aretha's early years in the music industry, first at Columbia Records starting in 1960, moved that way. Producers tried to make her into something she was not quite yet, a smooth, polished pop singer in the mold of the era's biggest crossover stars. The records sold modestly. The voice underneath them strained, like a person speaking someone else's language fluently, but without ever quite feeling at home in it. But listen closely to the choir behind her. Everything shifted in 1967. When she left Columbia for Atlantic Records and producer Jerry Wexler flew her down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to record with a small group of session musicians who did not care what a young black woman from Detroit was supposed to sound like. They only cared what she actually sounded like. Wexler later said it took him about an hour in that studio to realize he was in the presence of something the industry had been failing to capture for years. That February in New York, she recorded a song that Otis Redding had written and released 2 years earlier, a song about a tired, working man coming home and asking plainly for a little consideration from the woman waiting for him. Aretha did not simply cover it. She rebuilt it from the ground up, added the now famous backing vocals with her sisters Irma and Carolyn, spelling out the word letter by letter, and flipped the entire meaning of the song. It was no longer a man's plea. It was a woman's demand. When Otis Redding heard what she had done to his song, he reportedly told people, with something between amusement and awe, that the song belonged to her now. He never seemed to resent it. He seemed to understand better than most men in the industry that year that something had just happened that was bigger than a hit single. Respect reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1967. It became, almost instantly, something larger than a chart position. It became an anthem for the civil rights movement and, very quickly afterward, for the emerging women's movement as well. A single word demanded, spelled out, and never again asked for quietly. The Franklin family had never been far from that movement in the first place. Reverend C.L. Franklin was a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and young Aretha had grown up watching the two men talk, plan, and pray together in her father's study. She toured with Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference as a teenager, donating her performances to the cause before she was famous enough for anyone outside gospel circles to know her name. On April 4, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. Weeks later, at his funeral in Atlanta, Aretha Franklin stood and sang, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the hymn Dr. King himself had once requested be played at gatherings when he needed strength. She was 26 years old, singing for a movement that had just lost its most vital voice, in a church filled with grief so heavy it seemed to press down on the rafters. Witnesses in the room that day would later say that for those few minutes, the entire congregation forgot to breathe. This is where the story usually gets loud. But the truest parts of Aretha Franklin's life, in the years that followed, happened quietly, mostly out of the public's view. Her first marriage to Ted White had already ended by the time of Dr. King's funeral. After years that friends and family later described, in interviews and in biographies written with her cooperation, as difficult, Aretha rarely discussed the details herself, and this account will not invent them for her. What is documented is this: she came out of that marriage still singing, still working, and increasingly unwilling to let anyone control the terms of her own career. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, she recorded some of the most important albums in American music. I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, Lady Soul, Young, Gifted and Black. And in January 1972, she went into New Bethel Baptist Church, her father's own church in Los Angeles that week, not a concert hall, to record a gospel album with the Southern California Community Choir. Amazing Grace would go on to become the best-selling live gospel album of all time. Watching the footage today, filmed but not released as a documentary for over 40 years due to production issues, you can see something rare. Aretha Franklin, at the absolute peak of her secular fame, returning to the exact sound of her childhood, sweat pouring down her face, completely unguarded, completely home. But the decade that followed was harder. Sales declined through much of the 1970s as musical tastes shifted toward disco and funk. Her father was shot during a home invasion in 1979 and remained in a coma for 5 years before his death, a loss that friends said devastated her privately for the rest of her life, even as she continued performing publicly. By the early 1980s, some in the industry had quietly begun writing her career in the past tense. Stop, again, because the woman who had already rebuilt Respect from Otis Redding's original was not finished rebuilding herself. In 1980, she signed with Arista Records under the guidance of Clive Davis, a producer with a reputation for finding artists at the exact moment everyone else had given up on them. Davis paired her with contemporary songwriters and producers, and the result was a genuine second act. Jump to It in 1982. Freeway of Love in 1985, with its instantly recognizable saxophone solo, becoming one of the biggest hits of her career nearly 2 decades after Respect. I Knew You Were Waiting for Me, her 1987 duet with George Michael, gave her a #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic and introduced her voice to an entirely new generation of listeners who had grown up on MTV rather than gospel radio. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the honors accumulated the way honors do for someone who refuses to disappear. The first woman ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005, multiple Grammy Awards, including a special Grammy Living Legend Award. And on one particular night in February 1998, at the Grammy Awards themselves, opera legend Luciano Pavarotti was scheduled to close the show with Nessun Dorma, a piece far outside anything Aretha Franklin had ever performed publicly. When Pavarotti fell ill and could not go on, with only around 20 minutes' notice, Aretha Franklin walked out instead and delivered the aria herself, in her own voice, in her own register, in front of a live global broadcast. She had never trained as an opera singer. She simply refused to let the moment go unanswered. By the time Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, Aretha Franklin was already something closer to a national institution than a performing artist. She sang My Country 'Tis of Thee at his first inauguration in January 2009, wearing a gray felt hat with a rhinestone-studded bow that became, almost instantly, its own small piece of American pop culture, discussed and photographed as widely as the speech that followed it. Which brings the story back to December 2015 at the Kennedy Center Honors, 7 years into Obama's presidency and nearly 50 years after she first recorded Respect. The song chosen for her tribute that night was You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, a song Carole King had co-written for her in 1967, the same extraordinary year that gave the world respect. Aretha herself was being honored that evening as one of the recipients. Seated in the audience beside the Obamas, expecting to watch other artists perform in her honor, the way past Kennedy Center honorees typically do, then the curtain moved. She rose from her seat in the audience, walked to the front in that mink coat, letting it fall from her shoulders as she reached the piano, and sat down to play the opening chords herself. Nobody in the room, including many members of her own production team, had been told she planned to perform. What happened over the next 4 minutes has been described by nearly everyone who witnessed it as one of the most electrifying moments in the history of the Kennedy Center Honors. Her voice, at 73 years old, rose and cracked and soared with the same force it carried in 1967, if anything carrying more weight for every year that had passed since. Partway through, the cameras found President Obama in the audience, wiping his eyes, visibly and unmistakably moved to tears, applauding before the song had even finished. Aretha Franklin did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. She kept her eyes closed through most of it, the way she had as a teenager in her father's choir, singing not for the room and certainly not for the cameras, but for something further back, something the room could feel even if it could not name it. When the final note landed, she rose, dropped the mic hand to her side, and walked off exactly the way she had walked on, without ceremony, without a bow held a second longer than it needed to be. The ovation lasted for what felt like several minutes. She did not return for an encore. She had already said everything the song needed to say. 3 years later, on August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin died at her home in Detroit, surrounded by family, following a diagnosis of pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer that she and her family had kept largely private in her final years, choosing, as she nearly always had, to control the terms on which the public learned anything about her private life. Her funeral in Detroit ran for nearly 8 hours, filled with musical tributes from Stevie Wonder, Faith Hill, and dozens of others, a home-going service worthy of a woman the city had never stopped calling its own. In the months that followed her death, handwritten documents resembling wills were discovered in her home, one tucked inside a couch cushion in her living room, raising a legal question about her estate that would take years for a Michigan court to resolve. It is a strange, almost novelistic detail for a woman who spent her whole life so carefully controlling every note, every lyric, every performance, that her final wishes would end up folded into the cushions of her own sofa, waiting to be found. But perhaps it fits too. Aretha Franklin was never a woman who performed her private life for an audience. Even in death, she left the world with a mystery instead of a press release. What she left, more permanently, is harder to misplace. Every time someone sings a single word and means it as a demand rather than a request, they are, whether they know it or not, borrowing from a choir girl out of Detroit who rewrote a man's song into an anthem. Every time a president or a senator or a stranger in a folding chair finds themselves crying at a piece of music they did not expect to move them, they are experiencing something Aretha Franklin understood instinctively from the time she was a child standing beside her father's pulpit, that a voice, used honestly, can reach a person before their own defenses know to stop it. She never explained herself much in interviews. She rarely discussed her mother's death, her first marriage, or the exact nature of what she carried behind that quiet, regal composure for nearly 8 decades. Perhaps that was its own kind of respect for herself and for the parts of a life that are nobody's business but the person living it. The girl from New Bethel Baptist Church became the woman who could silence a room and move a president to tears, without ever raising her voice above what the song required. She asked the whole world once to spell out respect